Ancient Egypt was one of the greatest civilizations to ever inhabit this planet. It's only natural for it to have a religion of equal greatness.
No history book is complete without a section dedicated to the Egyptian civilization and its religion.
I mean, if you look back in time, there are three great civilizations that will stick out to most people as the three great civilizations in history. They're Rome, Greece, and Egypt.
It's amazing that people associate Egypt with pyramids and the Sphinx. But what most people don't realize is that Egypt started out with little reed huts.
Yes, the only reason why we know about these huts are from early paintings and hieroglyphic texts. These huts were made from wooden frames and woven reed mats. Also from the reed, the community made their shrines to the god, and since they were just made from reed and wood, they all have been decayed.
Now, in archaic and pre-dynastic times, we discovered recently that the king or tribe leader was considered the son of God. And this information is significant because until relatively recently, we didn't know what role the king played in these early rituals. Now we know that he was the most important person involved in them.
There have actually been recent discoveries of holidays, where on these holidays the shrine would actually be carried out of the hut and into the center of the town, and where they were celebrated very joyfully.
The ceremonies and holy days that date back to the pre-dynastic period eventually evolved into those that were celebrated in the New Kingdom. One festival was the Festival of Opet. It was a celebration of the link between the pharaoh and the god Amun, and it eventually started lasting 27 days out of the entire year. And what they would do is they'd start at Karnak, and they would pull a shrine, a very heavy shrine. It was about a ton. They'd pull it out and they'd carry it 1.5 miles to Luxor. And once they got there, they'd put it in a big pool of water, and they'd have the citizens ask it questions. And they'd only be yes or no questions. So the way they'd answer is, if the shrine dipped forward, it would be yes. And if the shrine dipped backward, it would be no. And then they brought that shrine eventually into the temple, and they locked it up, only allowing very special citizens access to ask it even further questions. And these questions were answered by the priests hiding in hollowed out statues.
Everybody knows about mummies and the Egyptian practice of life after death. This is all because of the media and our obsession with the dead. What many people don't know is that in the beginning of the religion, or at least the beginning of the religion as we know it, in the archaic period, they're actually fairly barbaric, at least our standards. When kings died in this time, they were buried with their slaves and women to accompany them in the afterlife. Eventually, the slaves and women were replaced with statuettes, which basically served the same purpose. But what surprises people to this day is their practice of cannibalism.
The story behind how the Egyptian gods came to be is a very interesting story indeed. There started off to be a lot of smaller tribes in ancient Egypt, and how these smaller tribes worshipped their own personal community god, and as the tribes got bigger, so the area of worship. Now the bigger tribes would absorb the smaller tribes and their gods. This is where you'll find how the Egyptian gods often multitask and have a dual personality.
Many gods and goddesses throughout the history of the Egyptian religion replaced or absorbed each other. It was natural. For example, Ra, the sun disk god, replaced the goddess Wenut, and eventually was replaced or absorbed by Amun and became Amun-Ra. And Amun-Ra was considered the king of gods. So throughout the entire civilization history of Egypt, it was always growing, always changing, just like their gods. Some of the gods we know to have come about around the beginning times were Min, the fertility god, Ta, one of the creator gods, Horus, Amun, Osiris, Isis, Ra, and of course Anubis.
Anubis played a massive role in the history of the Egyptian religion. We all recognize him as the jackal-headed god. He is known as the protector of the dead and a necropolis. He is also the overseer of the mummification process. So it's not unlikely that when a mummy is discovered, there's a statue or carving of some kind depicting Anubis or a jackal. After all, it was only through him that you could have a peaceful afterlife.
One absolutely great myth is the creation myth of the ancient Egyptians. In the beginning, there's a vast pool of water. It's absolutely vast. It was named Nun. From Nun came the primordial mound that was Atum. Atum was the actual creator god of the entire world. And from Atum came Shu, the air god, and Tefnut, the moisture goddess. And eventually from them came Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. It's very, very interesting that Geb was the male earth god, because you don't find many male earth gods, because earth is usually associated with femininity and with production and reproduction and fertility. And from Geb and Nut came Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Set. And this eventually leads into the battle between Osiris and Set, which is a very, very interesting myth itself.
Ancient Egypt is filled with wonderful myths. There's the creation myth with Adam and the Ennead. There's the battle between Osiris and his brother Set, which resulted in Osiris being cut up into 12 pieces and scattered throughout the world. And that led to the mourning of Isis, his wife, who searched the world for the 12 pieces. And of course the myth of Horus, the birth and flight of Horus, which led him to a spot above the gods.
Family life in ancient Egypt was very important. Everyone wanted children because they were considered blessings from the gods. If you could not have a child, ancient Egyptians would pray to the gods, begging them for children, and even leave letters in the tombs of their dead relatives, asking them to persuade the gods in their favor. And if the gods still did not bring them children, they could also participate in the adoption system.
The rights of women in ancient Egypt were very advanced for their time. They could participate in business deals, they owned their own land, and they were expected to represent themselves in court. They were even able to run their country as pharaoh.
Marriage in ancient Egypt was very advanced for its time. Although most of them were arranged marriages, they were sometimes given the chance to pick their own spouse. There were even prenuptial agreements that often stated the woman was to get an allowance from the man if the marriage ended. And any material possession that she'd bring into the marriage, she was allowed to take out if the marriage ended for any reason. She was even able to keep her own land separate from her husband's even during the marriage.
In ancient Egypt, divorce was very uncommon, but it was an option. If the man was mistreating the wife, she would go to her family, in which they would intervene with the husband and tell him to lay off. And if he didn't, the woman could still get a divorce, and all that it was a document in front of witnesses to annul the marriage and give the woman custody of any kids she had, and she could even remarry. Women had rights.